Hi, I'm Maggie. Thank you for stopping by Crafts the Charm today. I'm so glad you're here. This is my Lord of the Rings trilogy, and you can tell it's well loved. It seems like I used to read it almost every summer when I was younger. I really love Tolkien's descriptions of nature and particularly the woods around the Shire. So what I wanted to do today is use my woodblock gnome technique and make some of the wizards from the books and movies. I thought I would make Gandalf and Radagast. I'm not going to try to make Saruman, even though he has a really interesting staff, because Saruman, first of all, is evil, and second, because he doesn't wear a hat, and the gnomes really need to have a hat. But you could make any sort of wizard using this technique. Let's go have some fun.
Okay, so beginning with Gandalf. I bought this felt, the color is smoke, from Walmart, and I love felt that isn't just a solid color. So this has a nice gray, black, light gray texture to it. And I'm going to cut a piece to be Gandalf's hat, or the tall part of Gandalf's hat. And the piece I cut, you can see, is about 6 inches by about 9 inches. And super frustrating, I seem to have thought my camera was on when it was off and off when it was on. So you don't see me cutting the brim of the hat, but you can see that I have a circle there. The circle is 3 inches in diameter, and that I just used a compass to create, and I used that to cut out a circle of felt. And then you can tell, because I have the felt over one of my wood blocks, that I cut the center out of the circle so that I could slide it over the wood block. These are going to be wood block gnomes, like the gnomes that I made at Valentine's. Now I hope that I got my camera straightened out from here on in, so you can see that now the brim is joined to the hat, and the hat right at the bottom is also joined to itself where the seam is. And I think that you could do this with glue or by sewing, but what I wanted to do was needle felt this hat together. And if you haven't needle felted before, it's a particular kind of needle that has sort of barbs on it, and you poke it through the usually wool roving, but in this case, felt, 2 pieces of felt, and you poke and it sort of intertwines the fibers and mats them together. So I wanted Gandalf's hat to not really look like it had seams or not such obvious seams, so that's why I decided to needle felt the brim on. And I'm going to then cut the hat so that it's pointy. So I'm just sort of figuring out where I want that to be and trimming it, and then I'm going to needle felt it together to make a nice pointy hat. So I'm pinning that to hold it together temporarily, and I did have to make a couple of little sort of darts. I just sort of cut it because, again, I'm going to needle felt it, so it doesn't matter. I'll be able to join it back together. But it's always easier to make something that's supposed to look old and worn, and this won't necessarily look exactly like Gandalf's hat, but at least the hat that was made for him for the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings movies has some sort of scars on it. So I think it's going to be okay if we have some areas like that. So now you can see the felting process. And I did try to just sort of get it joined together without putting that sort of piece of foam behind it. But what I ended up doing was cutting the foam so that I could slide it inside my hat. And then basically all you do is you just keep poking where you want it joined together, being very careful not to poke your fingers because it really does hurt to stab yourself with this needle. And you do that until it is stuck together. So it does feel a little bit like magic. But yeah, so I'm not going to show you all of the needle felting. That is how I put this hat together. And I used the same exact process with the brim. When I cut the center out of the brim, I just folded up the edges on the inside and needle felted there so that it was stuck together on the inside. Now Gandalf's hat, again, at least in the movies, doesn't go straight up to a point, it sort of bends backwards. So I'm going to use a chenille stem and a little bit of fiber fill inside to give it a little fullness, but also to bend it. So I use the chenille stem to give it that bend, just stuffed inside. Very simple. Now, Gandalf has black boots, and so I'm going to paint these two little squares, which I got off of a wood bead wreath, which I bought at the Dollar Tree, and I'm just going to paint those black to be Gandalf's boots. And Gandalf's hat is actually supposed to be blue, but I really liked that gray felt, and I didn't think I would be able to find a really bluish gray felt like the hat in the movies and in many drawings that I've seen. So this is the same process I used to make my little wooden gnomes before. I'm just using wood glue to put the nose on, which is a bead, and wood glue to put the feet on, which are also beads, and then a little bit of hot glue to hold them in place while the wood glue dries. And this is the same process for the arms. I'm taking some of the nautical rope, the brown nautical rope from the Dollar Tree for the arms, and 2 beads for hands. And then I'm going to use some jute twine to both whip the end of the rope and hold that bead hand onto the end of the arm. So I put a little bit of twine through the bead, and then I glue the bead to the end of the rope, and I have put a little bit of masking tape around the end of the rope just to hold it in place while I go through this process. And then I hold those ends of the twine that are going through the bead over where the masking tape is. I make a loop out of a new piece of twine and start wrapping around all of those 4 pieces of twine, the 2 pieces that make up the loop and the 2 pieces that go through the bead, and wrap from the bead down towards the end of the loop, then cut the twine, put it through the loop, and then pull the other end of the loop. This will pull the loop under where it's been wrapped, then pull the end that went through the loop, pull both those ends to get it nice and tight, and then trim everything off. So I do that for both hands, and then glue the hands to the back of the block just under the hat. Now, with the Valentine's gnomes, I glued them to the side as well, so that the hands could come around in front. But with Gandalf, I know that I'm going to want him to hold his staff, so I think I'm just going to leave the arms out for now, and then if I decide I want them down, I will do something. I also want to give him a little cloak, which is something that I didn't do before. So I have some fabric from the Dollar Tree. It's one of these 18 by 21 inch pieces of fabric. Here are 2 other examples in green and brown. I have one that is sort of a gray or black, and I used part of this when I made the Valentine's gnomes. So I have some left over, and I'm going to use it to make Gandalf's cloak. And the process I used here is different from the process I used for Radagast, and I think Radagast's was actually a little easier to make. But for Gandalf, I just sort of put some fabric around his arms to basically figure out what size I wanted, and I wanted to make a sort of bell-shaped sleeve. So then I just cut that and just stitched it up. I think you could also glue it. I certainly wasn't stitching it very neatly. And then for the rest of the cloak, I took a rectangle of the fabric and I just stitched a hem all the way around, and then I attached it in the back to the sleeves and cut holes for the arms to go through. You can see that the piece started out about 6 inches by maybe 9 or 10 inches. I'm not sure if maybe it should have been a little bit larger. Again, I think I like what I did with Radagast's a little bit better. After I cut the holes for the sleeves, I took the whole thing off of him and just sewed the sleeves to the cloak on the inside. And I did tie it with a little bit of jute twine here. I was thinking I would look for a little piece of leather shoelace, But ultimately, in the end, once he had a beard, I liked the way it looked much better without it being belted. This is partly just because of the way it fell when it was belted. It looked like it was a little miniature coat, whereas it looked a little more flowy when it wasn't belted. Now, to make Gandalf's staff, I knew that this would be somewhat of a tricky staff to make because it has what looks like branches twisted around themselves at the top. So to get this effect, I took a bamboo skewer and I held it up to my little gnome and I cut it at the height that I thought it should be. And then here I have 22 gauge florist's wire, and I'm folding that in half and then twisting it around the top of the staff and then trying to twist it up near the top so that I have something like the shape of Gandalf's staff. I also have a small clear bead here, and I think I got these beads at Walmart for under $1, like close to $1. And I'm going to put that inside that staff at the top where the pieces twist around to make it look like the light that Gandalf creates when he uses his staff for light. And I twisted the wire down the bamboo skewer a little bit because Gandalf's whole staff looks like a piece of gnarled wood. I also then covered that with a little bit of hot glue where it is around the staff because I didn't want any sharp ends to poke out, and also just to emphasize that because I'm going to paper mache over it, and I just wanted to emphasize the shape. Now, this is bathroom tissue. You could probably use regular tissue or maybe newsprint, but this is what I'm using to cover the little staff, and it is difficult to work with because it sticks to your hands. I have a little bit of white glue, school glue, PVA glue here, mixing it with water, and then I won't say that I found any of this particularly easy, but what I ended up finding easiest was getting a little bit of glue on the wire and then using a hand that didn't have glue on it, if I had one of those, to take a piece of toilet paper and wrap it around the wire where I had put the glue. And then maybe putting a little glue over that just to get it completely saturated and smoothed over. And I just worked around the staff, trying to do that top part first, which was difficult. And I even pulled some of the pieces away from the staff because I figured I could always push them back in place after, but it made them easier to work. The other thing that makes it easier to work with this sort of bathroom tissue paper mache is to let some of it dry and then go back and work on it later. So I did some of the top and then I worked my way down the little staff, just wrapping the bathroom tissue around it, and then once it had dried, I returned and put a little bit more on. And I just covered the whole thing that way. Now I have this wool roving, which I think is raw wool. I don't think it's been dyed or anything. And what I'm going to do is paint it with a little bit of watered down gray paint. So I'm just going to take a little bit of it, and this is the apple barrel pewter gray paint. And I'm just going to paint it on there because I think I want to mix a little bit of gray into Gandalf's beard. So I'm just making some sort of grayish wool roving here. And once that had dried, I took some more wool roving, and I'm just going to mix that gray into the raw wool roving. And I'm going to glue that onto Gandalf's face under his nose with some hot glue, and I'm going to use that leftover piece of bamboo skewer to press that into the glue. Now I love this wool roving for gnome beards. This is what I usually use, although I used different materials when I made the Valentine's gnomes. And then I took another little thin piece for his mustache and glued that over the beard. And I think once you have a beard and mustache, this starts to look a lot more like Gandalf. Now with the staff, now that it is covered with the paper mache, I am going to try to paint it to look like wood. So I'm going to start with this burnt umber brown paint. And so my general idea is to start with sort of the middle tone of the wood, and then we do lowlights and highlights. So that's our middle tone, the burnt umber. Now I'm going to do the lowlights, and this is the color that I want to get into the cracks and that I want to look like shadow. So I'm going to mix the burnt umber with some black, and I tried to do this with watered down paint. I feel like that's good for lowlights because the paint runs into the cracks, but it might work better if you spray it on. Painting it on didn't work that well, so I did paint it on where I thought it belonged and then sort of dabbed it off. Now for the lowlights, I'm going to use the burnt umber and a little bit of white acrylic paint, and this I'm dry brushing over because I want this to be picked up by the raised textured areas. And I ended up doing that color, and then I ended up mixing a little bit more white in and doing a lighter color over that. And honestly, the staff was the part of this gnome that I think I like the best. I think without the staff, it wouldn't look like Gandalf, but I was very pleased with the way the staff came out. So I just, once it had dried, put that little bead in the center, and you can still bend the wire, so it was easy to get it in there. I didn't need to glue it. I tried to glue the staff to Gandalf's hand, but that really didn't work, so I ended up tying it with a piece of twine. That bead is tied to the end of the rope with twine anyway, so that worked just fine. I did sort of an X with the twine and then tied it in a square knot in the back. Now, he really needs to be on sort of a textured surface to get that staff to stand up next to him and look good, but I didn't want to glue it to his base or anything. I wanted to leave it freestanding. So it does stand up. It will even stand up on a table, but it's a little bit delicate. I think if it got knocked, it would not stay stood up. Now for Radagast, for his hat, I have this craft felt which I got at Walmart, and the color is walnut. Unfortunately, I couldn't get a nice textury brown color, which I would have preferred. And for Radagast's hat, I'm going to first cut the sort of main piece. Radagast has sort of an interesting hat. So first of all, just a piece that goes around the block. So 7 inches is usually what I cut to go around a block. And then I just sort of bent over the top and folded it in because I am going to be needle felting that. And then I cut 3 pieces, one for the flap in the front and one for the flaps on the sides, and pinned them down at first, but then just needle felted that all together. And then Radagast's hat is really beat up, just like Gandalf's, but really, really beat up. So I needle felted the whole thing. And if you needle felt on the other side, you get this sort of fuzz. So I needle felted it, I turned it completely inside out and needle felted it from the outside in to make it fuzzy and messy. But you'll see I do a lot more to this hat because I'm really not happy with how tidy it looks. So I have another one of these bead wreaths from the Dollar Tree, and this one has brown beads. So I thought those would be nice for Radagast's shoes. And I found some brown beads for his nose and hand that are round beads, and so I just attached those in the same way I did Gandalf's, with wood glue and a little bit of hot glue to hold it in place. And then I made his arms the same way I made Gandalf's. I cut some rope to go around his body, and then I put some beads on for hands and attached those with the rope whipping technique that I like to use, and then I glued the rope to his back under his hat. Now I'm going to use this brown fabric from the Dollar Tree, and I just love this fabric. So it did need an iron. Gave that a quick iron. And then what I did for Radagast, you can see, I just sort of cut a half circle, plopped that over his head, and then had another issue with my camera. So I started by just trying to sew that, I don't know what I was thinking, What I ended up doing, and you can't see it here, is I cut, and I'm sort of showing you with my fingers, I cut a slit, and then I just sewed the sleeve and sewed the sort of cloak part. And you can see the whole thing doesn't look awesome, but once we add a beard, you'll never notice. So I made Radagast's staff in the exact same way that I made Gandalf's, except his is a much easier shape. It has pieces that go away from each other, so it was much easier to cover this one with paper mache. His bead or light or crystal or whatever that is blue, so I'm using a blue bead in his. And for his beard, I painted some of my wool roving with my burnt umber paint. I also painted his staff in the same way, but my highlights are a little bit lighter for Radagast's staff. So for his beard, I just mixed in some of the brown and some of the gray I had left over from Gandalf, and then just glued it to him and gave him a mustache, the same I did for Gandalf. For his blue bead, I did need to glue it into his staff. Now for his hat, I just wasn't pleased with how it looked, so I took some dark brown wool roving and felted that into the hat. I sort of crinkled the hat and felted it in where I thought there would be creases. I think you could also use paint for this. And then I took the twine and I unwrapped it and cut it up into basically dust, applied glue to Radagast's hat all over, and sprinkled the dust over the hat. I felt this looked more like the hat that you see in the movies, just sort of, I don't know, just has this sort of light-colored fuzz on it. And finally, Radagast has a feather. So the way I made the feather is I took a small piece of cardstock, cut it into a feather shape, and then cut tiny little slots in it. And these just have to be very tiny, very close together. And that gives you a good appearance of a feather. You can kind of separate them away from each other, and just the closer together they are, the better. So then I just painted that with the burnt umber paint, and then dry brushed a little bit of brown and black over that to give it just some variation in the feather, like a bird might have different colors in their feather. And then I took a piece of black florist's wire and glued that down the middle as the sort of vein of the feather. Just used white glue for that. And then I was able to use that wire to stick it through Radagast's hat. And now you may have guessed that the hedgehog that I made a couple of weeks ago is supposed to be Sebastian, the hedgehog that Radagast saves. And so here are Gandalf and Radagast with Sebastian.
So, what did you think of our little Lord of the Rings wizards that are just little woodblock gnomes with wizard accessories? I don't think I have a favorite, do you? I think that one of my favorite parts is really the staffs. I really loved the way that they came out. And I do also like using wool roving for the beards and mustaches on my gnomes. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you enjoy this sort of content, please subscribe to Crafts the Charm. Thank you for spending time with me today. Take care.